the administration pushing new rules to shut down new coal leases, to shift the federal land management away from beneficial use like cattle grazing, logging, mining, to more just conservation, just set it and forget it. If you live in Montana, you witnessed the fires this year. And in fact, we're talking record fire amounts over the last several years that in large part were due to this administration just trying to shut down any productive activity on federal lands. And sadly, even Alaska, which I saw the brunt of it, they had congressionally mandated authorized use of the National Petroleum Reserve for a certain amount of lease sales to happen, and this administration came in and they shut that down. And what this does is it puts the United States its own little chamber where it can't function if there's a run on resources.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Hey everybody, Aaron Flint here. I host a statewide radio show called Montana Talks. Here in Big Sky Country, we cover a blend of local, state, and national issues, heard daily on about 20-plus radio signals across the state. But the podcast here was nice enough to ask me if I would guest host today's episode, because we're going to be discussing how the Biden-Harris administration's policies have affected the energy industry. And of course, Montana is just one of the several energy production states that have been impacted by decisions made by this administration. Our nation has been energy independent before, which means we didn't have to rely on other countries for our energy needs. Under the Biden-Harris administration, that changed because they started to cancel oil and gas leases, along with stopping pipelines from being built, even right here in Montana where I'm at. One of the first things President Biden did when he took office was to cancel the permits for the Keystone XL Pipeline that affected jobs here in Montana, South Dakota, and all the way down to Nebraska. One state alone has had roughly 60 executive orders or actions from the Biden-Harris administration taken against them when it comes to oil, gas, or natural resources. Some of these oil and gas leases were passed by Congress, but the U.S. Department of Interior canceled the leases because bureaucrats in the department said there were serious flaws in the lease sale. So what else has the Biden-Harris administration done that has impacted the energy sector? So great here to be filling in on the American Potential podcast as we talk about America's energy potential. Today, we've got Matt Keenan, who is a federal affairs liaison for Americans for Prosperity. Matt, great to see you in a neighboring state with us here today.
Aaron, absolute pleasure to be on this show. We miss Jeff, but it sounds like we're going to be in good hands with your hosting and a fellow Westerner from Montana. It's a real pleasure to be on here from the great state of Idaho.
Now, is Jeff up fishing in Alaska right now? Because I understand he was a little jealous you got some fishing in here in Alaska recently.
So I had a run around with Jeff about 2 months ago, and I let him know I was going to be up in Alaska, and yes, he was very jealous. He's like, I've got a bunch of fishing supplies stored up there. I'm ready to go. And then he mentioned you got to get outside the real to the real Alaska, outside of Anchorage, which we did. We hit the Kenai Peninsula. It was phenomenal.
I got to go to Yakutat, tag along with some fellow veterans from here in Montana, and man, catching halibut. I think I caught an 80-pounder. We had a guy catch a 100-pounder, and then the rockfish. We were just snagging those things left and right. It was an incredible time, and the lingcod. So I did not come home empty-handed. I trust the same for you.
Yeah, we actually got some silvers, and we were part of a group of folks that we were able to grab some halibut, some other local fish there. Apparently the pink salmon are the undesirable fish there, but they're sure beautiful, and the silver are great to eat. So I was just glad I caught the right fish.
Well, I know Jeff always likes to start with a fun fact, which is just a great way to get things rolling here. This is a really cool fun fact for our guest, Matt Keenan, today, because you've actually got family from Glasgow, Montana, which I moved around a bunch as a kid, but that's where I call home. Spent a lot of years growing up in Glasgow, Montana.
Yeah, actually, I have some extended family in Glasgow, and they are ingrained in that city. It's a wonderful town because everybody knows each other by name. if kids are out late at night, the parents will know exactly where they are because the other parent is calling, "Hey, your kid's out. What are they doing?" And one of the coolest things I love about that city is their hockey rink, I believe, is about the largest building in the entire city. And just driving through there, you think there's nothing there, but between the fishing, sports, activity, just a great time. I actually went to a couple state championships there, or there was a couple basketball tournaments being hosted there. I was able to see the Glasgow Huskies and on full display, and just love visiting there. It's really great. Fort Peck is premier.
Yeah, Fort Peck Dam and Fort Peck Lake's incredible. You can actually catch salmon near the marina. You got to get Jeff fishing at Fort Peck here one of these days then. Well, speaking of Glasgow, Montana, let's actually start with the Keystone XL Pipeline. Glasgow, Montana, just south of the Canadian border. If you go one county over to Phillips County, Montana, that's where the Keystone XL Pipeline would have first entered the United States. And so, we lost out a lot when President Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. One of the questions a lot of people have is, how does the president have the power to cancel a pipeline, and why isn't Congress involved?
So that was a lot of that project relied upon what is called a presidential permit, and a presidential permit is basically a de facto authorization on the executive side for a project like that to move forward. And President Trump in 2019 issued a presidential permit. It said that any obstructions to permitting building this project for the Keystone XL pipeline is hereby granted. And Congress can weigh in. Congress can pass legislation, hold oversight hearings. They can send angry letters. But in large part, it relied upon executive action by the president. And so when President Biden came in, day one, January 20th, 2021, he just reversed that order. So it was all very much on the executive side. Congress has made changes to different laws, but unfortunately, the Keystone XL pipeline, which had been in planning since 2008 to go through Montana, create thousands of jobs, if not tens of thousands of jobs. They consulted with multitudes of different groups to make sure that the route was good. It would have ended up in Nebraska, but it really was a national security blow to the United States to have that project canceled.
Not only the thousands of jobs that were lost, not only the impact on energy prices, but here in Montana alone, it was estimated at the time that anywhere from $65 to $100 million every single year would have come in to these eastern Montana counties just in revenue alone from the Keystone XL pipeline that could have gone back in the form of infrastructure and so much more. Well, also along Montana's High Line, not only are pipelines important, but railroad jobs are key all along that northern tier, really, of the United States of America. I want to talk railroads here in just a second, because it's not just pipelines that they're stopping. There's railroad jobs that they're getting in the way of here as well. But first, I mentioned a few of the things that the Biden-Harris administration has done. What else is the Biden-Harris administration doing when it comes to energy policies since taking office, really in a broader context?
Well, they've certainly been busy the last 4 years. They've withdrawn minerals, especially Montana related. They stopped new leases for coal in the Powder River Basin. That negatively impacts Montana and Wyoming. They've also introduced a rule called the MATS and HAPS rule. It's a mercury air toxic standard. Basically, it's a new rule that'll make it all but impossible to run coal-fired power plants, which degrades your electrical infrastructure. Besides, like the EV mandate, they've also increased restrictions in the federal forest. They've managed to just about shut down the state of Alaska. When you're talking about railroads, jobs, coals, anything like that, these Western states are predominantly federally owned. So anytime that there's a sneeze out of Washington, D.C. to restrict something, to inhibit access, it really impacts Montana and Utah. And a lot of our transportation infrastructure in the West is predominantly by rail.
We've got a coal mine south of Roundup, Montana right now. They're wondering if they're going to have to do layoffs later this year. They might have to shut down entirely next year. They just had a big rally for Montana coal there recently. You mentioned these mercury standards. We're concerned that we might potentially lose Colstrip, a very important coal mine and coal-fired power plant here in Montana. Let's talk railroads, too, before we get into Alaska, oil and gas lease sales being blocked off by the Biden-Harris administration. This one was crazy. This is a very recent story. I saw that Montana's attorney general is getting involved along with several other attorneys general from across the country. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, now trying to stop a rail line from being built in Utah that would transport crude oil to Louisiana. What is the EPA claiming here that this rail line could potentially do? This shows it's not just about pipelines. It's not just about leases. They're even trying to go after railroads here.
So the EPA generally weighs in on NEPA reviews. So if you have a project, the National Environmental Policy Act is a process by which federal actions can be weighed against environmental concerns. When the EPA does come in, traditionally, they're just there to be a consultant. Really what the hangup is recently a DC court said, hey, no, you can't do this railway because we need to look at the implications of environmental justice for communities in Louisiana. Now, Utah and Louisiana are about 1,500 miles away from each other. And the barrier that the EPA has laid in this process is already very extensive. So when the EPA came in and they started consulting with the project sponsor, the Surface Transportation Board, which regulates a lot of the railroad infrastructure in the United States, approved this, given that the project sponsor to transport this oil to Louisiana actually consulted with an Indian tribe, consulted with justice community, an environmental tribe, and they modified where this railroad was going to go to ensure that the concerns of the locals in Utah, not just the state and the citizens there, but the tribes as well. And in that process, the DC Circuit circumvented this entire thing. DC Circuit Court of Appeals circumvented this whole entire process and stopped the project because they said, oh, well, you haven't done enough to consult with the impacts that this will have on Louisiana communities. I can tell you right now, between the economic benefits, between the wealth generation that's created, not only that, the jobs, the families that are held together, those benefits should be part of that review process to ensure that we're not limiting ourselves to arbitrary standards. And that's unfortunately what happened. The EPA in the past has been a barrier in many of these cases by keeping the review process down to the minutia of details that shouldn't apply. But the Surface Transportation Board approved this project. The DC Circuit Court, though, unfortunately came through and just kind of said, hey, no, you can't do this.
The administration has not only been using NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, in this case, but they've been trying to leverage NEPA, pile more things into NEPA to go after American energy resources, to curtail American energy production. For the American potential audience out there, talk a little bit more about what NEPA actually is.
Yeah, so NEPA was passed out of the late 60s. It's a review process, very much like, hey, if you're going to go do something and you're the federal government, what are the environmental impacts? Plain and simple, it's what the federal government is going to do. Unfortunately, through litigation, bureaucracy, it's been used as a roadblock to a lot of very beneficial projects. So in some cases, we're talking projects taking infrastructure projects, energy projects, railway projects taking decades to get to completion. And so NEPA, while passed in the 60s and amended a couple times since then, it was meant to just be a simple checkbox, really, to say, hey, the federal government's actions in this arena are not going to have negative implications on the environment. Or if there are going to be negative implications, here's what we're going to do to modify that. You saw that work in Utah with the railway, or the Surface Transportation Board, the review, the changes to that railway plan. But NEPA really has turned into a barrier to America's, frankly, energy independence and energy potential into the future.
And oftentimes what we've seen here in states like Montana is we have our own MEPA process, our own Montana Environmental Policy Act. So you get this duplicitousness out there. It's all these reviews are already being done, but oh no, let's go through this whole process again. And now they're piling on top of that. How else has NEPA been used? Because, man, I saw a report here recently that just detailed all the ways the Biden-Harris regime is trying to curtail American energy production. They're leveraging the SEC to try to curtail investment in the private sector, oil and gas production as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Not to get too into the weeds, NEPA, again, is just a simple review process. What they did, Congress about a year and a half ago said, hey, we need to streamline this. We're going to have a timeline for these review projects to happen. You have what are called environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. And those are simply documents that just say, hey, here's the impacts of a project on a particular portion of land or whatever else. What the Biden administration did is they added things about environmental justice communities. They added things called indigenous knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with consulting with different groups of people across the board on a potential project's impact. There's nothing wrong with that. Indigenous knowledge, though, is not defined. Like if you were to ask one person, what is indigenous knowledge versus another person's terms and what is indigenous knowledge, it won't match. And so they've really opened Pandora's box to allow for many different layers and hurdles to go through a NEPA process. And when you mentioned Montana's got a process, well, California has a process. All these different states have the process. And really, NEPA is being used in a lot of cases to deny beneficial projects in oil and gas, even in some cases with wind energy. You know, this Biden administration is super pro wind energy, but in a lot of cases, NEPA is no longer about a logical review process. It's being turned into a litigious roadblock to many different areas of the country, all frankly to America's detriment.
I remember some 20 plus years ago, I was, a college student in DC at Howard University, and I was a young staffer on Capitol Hill, and they brought this blue energy policy book up to Capitol Hill, and it described America's energy potential, which is, of course, what we're talking about here today on the American Potential podcast. We're talking with Matt Keenan, Federal Affairs Liaison for Americans for Prosperity. It's no longer hypothetical. 20 plus years ago, they said, hey, this is America's energy potential. And the critics said, oh, come on, there's no way we can tap into those resources. Well, then we started rocking the Bakken and we started unleashing American energy. And now we know this isn't just hypothetical. The previous policies showed that we can tap into this potential. Right now, they're discouraging the tapping into this potential. Vice President Kamala Harris, she said that the Inflation Reduction Act, that it actually increased oil and gas leases. They'll make several claims like this. Tell us what actually happened here.
Yeah, sure. Look, on paper, they did increase lease sales, primarily in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when you do that, they also incorporated a clause in there that they had to increase oil and gas lease sales alongside wind energy. Now, guess what? You had a couple issues in New Jersey, New York. Martha's Vineyard had one blow up. The supply chain's all goofed up now. Prices have increased dramatically since the Inflation Reduction Act has passed. You know, the name of that whole thing is tremendously funny because Biden just came out and said, oh, we should just call it this. You know, it's practically just a slush fund. But in that process, what you had is President Harris, yes, on paper, it's correct. She did vote. She was a tie vote on the Inflation Reduction Act to increase lease sales. But when the administration started getting pushback on the wind projects, they then tailed back on the oil and gas leases. And within the IRA, there were supposed to have at minimum 2 lease sales. And they drug their feet for the longest period possible, all while they're trying to put intermittent energy sources as a primary piece to power the country's future in the ocean. Well, guess what? The folks that live in New Jersey, the Atlantic coast folks didn't want to hear it. And really what's come down to bear on a lot of these projects is the costs have just just absolutely exploded. They're not going forward. And meanwhile, you have a reliable, beneficial, wealth-enhancing product in the Gulf of Mexico that we know how to harvest, we know how to utilize it, and it's all but been shut down, unfortunately, over the last few years in this administration.
When we talk about the environmental track record, Jesse Ramos, the state director for Americans for Prosperity Montana, him and his team have been doing an incredible job. They did a Prosperity as Possible tour all across Montana. They went to the hydropower dams. They went to Colstrip, and so much more. But he shared some interesting statistics here. Our natural gas, Montana natural gas, American natural gas, 40% cleaner than Russian natural gas. Talk about coal. You know, we live in Powder River Basin coal country here in Montana and Wyoming. Powder River, Letter Buck. This is the cleanest coal in the world. That Signal Peak coal mine I told you about, 5 of their 7 million tons a year of coal is going to Japan. The Japanese want this clean source of energy. And even though we have the best environmental track record, we have an administration right now that is forcing us, not just with an anti-American energy agenda, but with an anti-mining agenda, forcing us to get needed minerals from other countries that have nowhere near the environmental track record that we have.
You're absolutely right. You know, in many cases, we want the cultivation of these natural resources here in the United States. We have the strongest track record for environmental concern and safety and outcomes. Many of the mines that there's one that just opened up here in Idaho that has been in review, the Stibnite mine by Perpetua Resources. They have been consistently pushing the administration to open up that mine to allow for American domestic mineral refining, promote our manufacturing. And unfortunately, what's happened in this administration, you've seen it all throughout the West. In a lot of cases, you have the shutdown of the forests, you have the shutdown of these mines, you have the administration pushing new rules to shut down new coal leases, to shift the federal land management away from beneficial use like cattle grazing, logging, mining, to more just conservation, just set it and forget it. If you live in Montana, you witnessed the fires this year. And in fact, we're talking record fire amounts over the last several years that in large part were due to this administration just trying to shut down any productive activity on federal lands. And sadly, even Alaska, which I saw the brunt of it, they had congressionally mandated authorized use of the National Petroleum Reserve for a certain amount of lease sales to happen. And this administration came in and they shut that down. And what this does is it puts the United States in its own little chamber where it can't function if there's a run on resources, or if we do need to shift to our allies. When Ukraine wants to go to the market for liquefied natural gas, do we want that? Do we want them beholden to the Russians? I don't think so. And so when you talk about the XL pipeline coming through Montana, bringing jobs to the country, allowing for exports to our allies like Japan, like Ukraine, the really important thing is to remember that it's cleaner here in the United States, it's better for our rural communities, and it keeps jobs the center focal point. And it's also a national security issue, frankly, because if our allies cannot depend upon us, who else are they going to go to?
God, you mentioned Ukraine. I remember very early on, I saw a friend with a hat here in Montana, Midland over Moscow. And that was the best thing we could have done, is just unleashed America's energy potential, really, in one of the best things we could have done in that situation. You mentioned Ukraine. Let's talk about the Middle East. If America had remained energy independent, look, I've served in the Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, the Arabian Peninsula, but if we had remained energy independent, how do you think that what is happening in the Middle East right now, how would our energy independence have kind of sheltered Americans from what's going, or maybe even shaped what's going on in the Middle East and the potential impact on oil prices here?
Yeah, you make a wonderful point. And actually, Aaron, thank you for your service too.
Thank you.
You've seen the ups and downs of that region. But just speaking from the U.S. perspective, look, the global markets for oil are truly global. It's a worldwide market. It's hard to distinguish between different sources. But here's the thing: is when we're producing energy and we're making it better for energy producers and refiners here in the United States to produce a good product, whether it be LNG, crude, fuel oils, any of those things, when we are able to project through soft power our energy dominance, that keeps our allies firmly supplanted to our best interest, our mutual best interest. And when Biden in 2022, if you remember, this probably $5 or $6 a gallon of gas in Montana, or at least above $4, he was hammering OPEC to produce more. While he was actively shutting down leases and opportunities for Americans, he was demanding that OPEC increase production. I don't know that we have ever seen a president beg a cartel to increase their production. So when we're not energy independent, when we're not producing to our full potential, we're frankly putting the world in a more dangerous place. And we have seen in a lot of cases that the Middle East, yes, it is a very it can be a chaotic area. But what we want to do is for our allies, when we're energy independent, we can actually bring that soft power to bear, and it makes their lives a lot easier in a mutual beneficial way.
That's right. And I know there's so many law enforcement veterans, first responders, fellow veterans that listen and subscribe to this American Potential podcast. Thanks to all who've served, but also thanks to those roughnecks out there. I mean, those men and women that are out there in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford and the Marcellus Shale. You are a huge part of American national security, and that oftentimes doesn't get recognized. I know one thing that Americans for Prosperity that you guys have been talking about. I know Jesse Ramos here in Montana has been hitting the ground talking about this. There's a bill in Congress called the REINS Act that would try to rein in some of this craziness on the regulatory side of the House. In fact, I think the co-sponsor is Congresswoman Kat Kamak out of Florida. She's going to be here in Montana.
That's right.
In just a few days. So looking forward to seeing her in.
We love her.
She's great. She'll be in Kalispell. You should come join us. That's another beautiful part of the state. So,
I would love to. If I can make that swing, I certainly will. And it's a wonderful bill. Frankly, when you talk about where was Congress when it came to the Keystone XL Pipeline, where was Congress when President Biden was shutting down Alaska? Where was Congress when Montana got screwed out of their coal leases? Really, frankly, the REINS Act brings back a lot of the accountability that Congress needs to keep these agencies in check. And in a lot of cases, the way the REINS Act works is basically say the EPA comes forward with a rule and they say, hey, we want to outlaw everyone's internal combustion engines. Congress actually can have a process where, okay, hang on, that's a pretty big deal. So what we're going to do is actually that needs to be approved by Congress. Both chambers have to approve it. Both the House and the Senate have to go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Your justification works out for how this rule is done. Once it's approved, then it actually moves forward to the rulemaking process where you can get comment from the different industries. And really what the REINS Act does is it brings that natural accountability and policy action that Congress would have taken decades ago before these agencies were just spitting out rules. And if there's something that has an economic impact of $100 million or more, it's automatically triggered under the REINS Act. And to get it through Congress, a member of Congress actually has to come forward and say, here's the bill that we're going to approve this rule by. And then the same thing in the Senate. So there's a lot of hurdles to actually ensuring that the agencies aren't just putting out rules. I can tell you right now, if you went to Montanans and you said, hey, we're going to get rid of your new coal leases so we can meet U.S. climate goals, what would the answer be? It would be a defounding no, we don't want to hear that. Daines and the rest of the Montana delegation would probably have people with pitchforks out there saying, hey, don't let that happen.
They'd take you back to that hockey arena in Glasgow and show you the HE double hockey sticks. That's what they'd tell you.
Oh, they sure would. They sure would. And in a lot of cases, if this moves forward, say a rule moves forward, it's going to move forward with the feedback that Congress gives it, the authorization that Congress needs to provide for it, and the consent of the governed. This is what this country is about. We went to war with the biggest empire in the world over the consent of the governed. It's like a 2% tax. And so when you talk about de facto agency bureaucracy determining the future of whole swaths of the economy, the REINS Act, thankfully led by Kat Kamich, a wonderful member from Florida. We're, of course, praying for everyone in that region these days, given all that's happening. But really, frankly, she's been a huge leader in trying to push accountability for these different agencies to literally rein them back in, bring them before the germane committees, have them answer the tough questions, have them actually get the approval of Congress, and in large part, it would restore a lot of the balance of executive and legislative, the executive and legislative branches.
And the recent Chevron decision out of the United States Supreme Court reining in that early 1980s ruling, I mean, that's going to be huge wind at their backs in these efforts to rein in and really what's been an unchecked bureaucracy. Matt Keenan, Federal Affairs Liaison for Americans for Prosperity. Man, it's been great to catch up with you. I forgot, did you get Eugene's Pizza when you were in Glasgow, Montana, by chance? I meant to ask you about it.
I'm sure at one point I did.
Oh, you would remember if you did. You would remember, yeah.
The Pizza Hut. I have been to the Pizza Hut.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
That's a staple. But yeah, wonderful community. Anytime I visit Montana, it's a wonderful time. Hope to fish at Fort Peck at some time soon. But Aaron, it's been a real pleasure. I look forward to hearing you as the big voice of Montana on your daily show here soon. I'll tune in for sure.
Well, thank you. If people want to reach out to Americans for Prosperity, whether nationally or your local chapter across the country, Matt, how can they, support these efforts of what you're talking about to rein in this unchecked bureaucracy? You name it. I know they can reach out to Jeff at AmericanPotential.com. He can help get these stories shared. He can help get people tapped in. Or if people want to, reach out through the American Potential Facebook, YouTube, Twitter pages, things like that. How can people get tapped in so that they can unleash this American energy potential?
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, as you know, Americans for Prosperity is primarily a grassroots organization. We have 37 state chapters. If you go to afphq.org, you can actually click a link that you'll find your state chapter there, and you can get connected with local folks who are active in their communities. They're concerned about the issues of energy. And again, that's afphq.org. That'll put you right in touch with people in your community to get involved.
All right, Matt, thanks again for your time. And hey, if you out there, if you know a great story, you know somebody who has an incredible message to share when it comes to expanding freedom, expanding opportunity, or they can articulate the American potential that's out there, you can go to AmericanPotential.com. They have a button that says share your story. Click that share your story button. And hey, who knows? Maybe you could be on the next American Potential podcast as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.